Okay, it seems to be recording. It says it's recording. So can you folks hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, it's recording. So and I appear to be logged in as sig-auth lead, which I believe is the correct account. So I think everything should work. So yeah, you guys can present. That would be fine.
Okay, Yisui, you want to go ahead and share your version?
Okay, let me share. Can you see screen?
Yeah, you can make it full size. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is some work we plan to do. We are trying to introduce a tenant CRD into Kubernetes based on previous work. There's a few work has been proposed and also some ideas follow up in the community. So as a discussion between Sanjeev and me, we have some details. What we plan to do in short term and with a relative fast iterations by introducing something to define a tenant in Kubernetes. Because today there's a lot of building blocks in Kubernetes. It's difficult to have a consistent representation of a tenant if we want to share the cluster in the multi-tenant use cases. So by introducing a CRD object, which can be used or help to represent the tenant idea or concept in a unified way, and that will help other to align other building blocks, and we can probably roll out a good tenant model to make all other Kubernetes features to be more tenant aware. So based on a few proposals and KEPs, we plan to do something like a quick POC prototype with a few iterations. And we try to keep each iteration very minimal. We will share the work with community for each iteration. And we also if anyone from community can help on these iterations, you are always welcome. And the goal is to try to collect feedback from community for every step or every thoughts we have, if that makes sense or need any changes. So Sanjeev, can you take over to go through the behavior specification?
Yes, thanks, Yisui. So what we've been discussing, I'm not going to go over each of these things, but I'll just mention a few kind of highlights. So we are doing the behavioral specification in terms of three personas. There's a cluster admin, there is a tenant instance admin, and then there is a tenant developer, right? And so the assumption is that a Kubernetes cluster would have been set up to be capable of multi-tenancy support. What is the checklist of items that you need to follow that this group will recommend? That will be documented in a separate document, right? So we will have a document which says you must have this enabled in your cluster to be multi-tenant capable. We may also provide an auditing tool that allows you to run against a cluster and says, yes, your cluster is multi-tenant capable or not. Once you have this multi-tenant capable cluster, then this document is going to talk about the tenant workflow and new CRDs that we are proposing. So the basic thought right now, actually, I'll jump straight to the picture. If you can scroll down, Yisui, I'll skip over the text. Is there some way to magnify this picture a bit?
Let me check if...
Okay, that's a little better. So what Yisui and I have been thinking is we're looking at potentially 4 custom resources. A tenant custom resource, which is shown in the top left. And then at the bottom, we have 3 potential custom resources: namespace template, a tenant template, and a tenant request and CR. Now, these are details of implementation, and UC is going to describe that in more detail, but I'm just giving the little bit of a behavioral specification. But in order to keep it a little bit more specific rather than make it too high level, I'm using these specific CRs. But this is actually the implementation, little bit of implementation detail, which Yisui will describe more. But I'll just use it to describe the behavior. So we're thinking of at least multiple, as Yisui said, multiple iterations and multiple workflows. The very simple, the minimal base version workflow would be as shown in the middle column in the picture, which is very as simple as kubectl create new tenant.yaml. Okay, so there will be a new custom resource called tenant, and any tenant admin would be able to do a kubectl create and get this new tenant. This tenant will have a predetermined template that the cluster admin would have already decided. So every time somebody comes in and says, create me a new tenant, they will get one of these. And the tenant will have attributes like a tenant description and admin user. But we are still deciding whether it needs to have things like quotas and all that, because quotas are dynamic. You can come back later and increase your quotas also. So maybe we will not have quotas initially. Your very minimal workflow is just give me a tenant object, and my group and I, meaning my the exact mapping of the authentication we are still working through, but basically this authentication group is mapped to this tenant, and we automatically set some kind of access control and pod isolation policies, okay, based on a template that is not configurable, because we are talking about the minimal one here. Now the full version is that if you scroll down, there are these different templates. Still stay up. Yes, we just
Okay.
yeah. So now there are additional namespace template, tenant template, and tenant request custom resources. Namespace template defines attributes of a namespace. Tenant template is separate at the moment, but we could merge it with namespace template. The point is that a tenant template could include one or more namespace templates, because a tenant can include more than one namespace. In the initial release, again, we may say tenant equals only one namespace, but to keep it general, tenant will include multiple namespaces in the future. And tenant requests. So the workflow here would be a tenant admin either requests a tenant by providing an instance of the tenant template that was already created for him by the cluster admin. Cluster admin has created 5 different templates, and tenant admin does a create using the tenant request object in this case. Okay, so this is like an asynchronous model. You have a tenant request object, specify a tenant template instance, and once that request has been fulfilled by the cluster admin, either through a manual intervention or automatically, that tenant matching that template becomes available to that instance admin. So this is the high level thing we are still working out, and we of course continue to. So we are doing it in simple version as well as more complex version. Also partly motivated by OpenShift, because OpenShift has a basic minimal model where you can just say OpenShift create project and that works, right? But then you can also have more complicated model where you have a project request template and cluster admin creates these templates upfront, and then the user says, okay, create a project based on this template. Also, as Yisui said, part of it is motivated by all the work that he did earlier with namespace templating and so on, which he'll describe in a moment. So we are thinking of making it more generic than OpenShift also, but start off with a simple one and then keep iterating on that. So that's kind of the high level summary. And I think Yisui is now going to, if you have, do you have any questions on the high level sort of workflow?
I do, yeah, if possible. So over the past few weeks, we've been talking about like having, the phase one, which was just like an articulation of all the existing RBAC features and network policies and, features that could be used for multi-tenancy in some sort of prose document. And then the plan for the CRD was to kind of encapsulate configurable attributes of all of this into some higher level resource in the Kubernetes object model. Whereas this custom resource definition seems like it's fulfilling a very specific kind of like request response sort of use case where you have people in an organization that like want access to a multi-tenant cluster, and the person that grants them access isn't the person who's requesting access or something. Like there's this very specific relationship that goes on, but it doesn't really seem to address any other Kubernetes security features with regards to resource isolation, or if a single administrator wants to run multi-tenant workloads or anything like that. So I just perhaps you could just help me understand these two things here.
Right. Your point is absolutely valid. And as we said earlier, that work defining a set of attributes like isolation attributes and so on would be part of a separate document. And of course, later on, one or more of these documents could be merged, but this document is not currently targeting that. So goal is that how, if we can provide some reference templates, right? That will be where we will say, okay, here's a reference template where you can use RBAC for access control, pod security policies for runtime control, CNI network policies for network control, and that would be one example of a template. But this document is talking about the machinery of using the templates as opposed to defining the contents of the templates themselves. So those are both parallel activities which our group needs to do, whether we do it in this doc as well, or whether at the moment the thought is that's a separate doc.
I see. So you're saying that like in the future, we'll just add things to the namespace template custom resource if we want to expand the kinds of levels of control that we could have over a given tenant?
So Yisui will describe a little bit more about namespace template just now, but one of the thoughts that he's thinking is that to have it very bit open-ended, meaning that we may have some reference templates, but the template can have anything. You can define your own template and decide that's your set of namespace values. So Yisui will describe that just now. Why don't we go through, if there are no more questions on the overall workflow, I think Yisui can describe some more details on what he has been defining.
I was just going to say, Mike, one of the other things that we discussed, because there's so many different variants on what a tenant actually is, one of the other things that we kind of said we want to do is define the minimum set of kind of primitives that you can piece together. And from what Sanjeev just said, because you can actually define your own versions of these templates, this seems like a nice bottom-up way to kind of do that. We can aggregate things together later on.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, this, just as Sanjeev mentioned, these are parallel work streams. So we are working on. So for today's document, we'll focus on some mechanism like CRDs to actually carry on these primitives or whatever the rules we want defined for multi-tenant cluster. So a separate document will be like a more detailed description on the functions, what are proposed profile will include without defining the actual mechanism how to implement or enforce that. So this document will give some proposal on possible ways these profile content can be represented and how they can be populated. So the goal of this this work stream is basically try to define or implement the mechanism iteration by iteration. So first, we will need to have a minimum definition of like a tenant, which is a tenant CRD. And later on, in next iteration, we probably will introduce a namespace template that can be the representative way of a multi-tenant profile for all the details in defining the profile. So the ideal workflow is like the class admin will be focusing on defining all these policies and to hardening the cluster, while for the tenant users, they just simply choose one of the predefined profile or whatever set of policies to be applied in their namespaces. That's the reason we define the tenant CRD, and for the tenant user, they just create a tenant CRD and reference a some sort of a template that defined by class admin. So the basic idea is basically inspired by the OpenShift project model, and we try to move beyond that by adding the namespace template that the class admin can basically define beforehand for everything, and have full control of the class configuration. So starting the details of the tenant CRD, we will start from simple, just define, we can take a look at the tenant spec. So when a tenant admin creates a tenant, they just specify the admins who has an administration privilege in the tenant namespaces, and then providing a list of namespace. And for each of namespace, you can specify a name and a template. The template is basically referencing the name of a namespace template, which defines all the policies to be populated into the namespace. And the namespace template is predefined by the class admin. So by introducing this CRD, we will also have a few like conditions associated with CRD to represent whether the tenant is being created, it's ready, or it's being like removing. Very basic stuff. So we can start from a simple iteration by implementing this tenant CRD with a controller without thinking about the namespace template. So what it does is basically controller watch the tenant CRD. When a CRD is created, it moves on to create a namespace for the tenant and only populate the minimum policies like the RBAC rules for the tenant admin. That's all. That's the goal for the first iteration. And the second iteration.
You see, let me just jump in here just a second.
Yeah.
One way to look at, and just to clarify to everyone as well, one way to look at the minimal version is that there is an implicit default template, right? Which will be used for the very basic workflow. So when you just want to have a workflow which says create me a new tenant, there is an implicit non-configurable template in the cluster which is effectively being used. And that implicit, we're not explicitly calling out as a template, but those implicit set of rules will be used in the basic workflow because there is no template defined explicitly in that case. And that is similar to, I mean, if in OpenShift, for example, when you create a new project, you can create a new project without having defined any template. And then their implicit rules of RBAC and security contexts are applied. But then you can explicitly define a template. And in that case, you have the more complete workflow in which you create a tenant using a template. So what we are proposing here is that effectively the basic workflow, when the user just says, create me a project, essentially has an implicit template, but we don't call it out as a template. It's just an implicit set of rules.
I'm trying to avoid use this implicit template concept because it will be introducing another concept once we have this namespace template concept. So, but you are right. If we think that as an implicit template, that's fine. So
it's an implicit set of rules. That's why I didn't want to explicitly call it out as a template, but effectively that's what it is. Whether we call it a template or an implicit set of rules, what the point I'm trying to convey is that even in the basic workflow, there is a specific set of actions. It's not like there's a tenant CRD created and a namespace and we are done. It's more than that. Even in the basic workflow, we do want to have a set of RBAC and security policies set up, even with the basic workflow. But those are not configurable policies. Later on, when we add the templating, then they will be configurable.
I will say so let me highlight this part. So in the tenant spec, we have admins and namespaces. I mean, in the first iteration, we'll probably ignore the namespace list. And the admin list will be interpreted as a set of RBAC rules. If you say that as a implicit template, and yes, so we can treat it as that. And if you want to do something interesting, you can hard code some role bindings for a pre-created policy. But that will eventually be explicit when we introduce the namespace template concept. And for the workflow, when user creates a tenant CRD without specifying a template, we will introduce some sort of like a default template to be used. So that simplifies the workflow. But internally, when the namespace template is ready, all the concepts should be aligned using a single solution instead of like implicit or explicit kind of concepts. I'm trying to avoid using that terms.
Yeah, I think we are saying the same thing here, whether we call it default or implicit. The point is that there is, even with the basic workflow, there is some set of isolation which will be done even in the basic workflow. And again, that's just to maintain the analogy with OpenShift. Even in OpenShift, when you create a project without specifying any template, it still creates some basic default rules for isolation. So to keep that analogy, to preserve that kind of analogy is my point, that whether we call it a default or an implicit, even in the basic workflow, there will be some RBAC and isolation rules applied. Because if we don't, then we haven't really done anything other than create an object called a tenant, and there is absolutely no isolation at all, then it's not basically a usable solution.
So I think that for me, the problem with it, if we're kind of saying it's implicit as opposed to explicit but default, is if it's implicit and it's just kind of assumed stuff that happens, it's kind of a bit magic. How do you version that? Like, how do we move forward with you when that gets richer? It's sort of in the docs. It's not in code. You know what I mean?
Yeah, implicit. Let's treat it synonymously with default. Okay. There is a default set of rules that get applied. But then if you want a configurable custom set of rules, then you want to create templates. Anyway, we don't need to go around that too much. The point was, again, largely preserving the OpenShift analogy here. In OpenShift, you can create a new project in the simplest workflow without creating a template, and in a more complicated workflow with a project template. So we want to support similarly both those options and more. That's the net of it. But yeah, you say please keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So next, so for the second iteration, we will focusing on the namespace template. So the best way to describe that, maybe we can take a look at the example in the comment. So the namespace template is another CRD. The spec only contains a list of templates. So in this templates, you can basically list any kind of namespace scoped Kubernetes resource. So that gives the best flexibility. And so if we define the structure in Go language, we will use this runtime role extension to include everything. So with that idea, basically, you are able to define the resources which exist in today's Kubernetes, and also possible for future if we install anything which introduce some CRDs or any custom like CRD controller kind of things. We can also use that for namespace template. An alternative design is like I see us a few open source projects are using is basically define explicitly the known resource types in the namespace template. That's actually good for everything to be explicit and good for like type checking kind of things. The downside is it's difficult to support like arbitrary policy objects defined by CRD or in future versions. So one more important thing is about the ownership of a tenant. So with the tenant CRD, the most important part we try to introduce is we can use the owner reference in metadata of all the resources which belong to a tenant CR to represent the ownership information for the tenant. And currently, as everything is captured into the namespaces, the tenant user does not supposed to have a permission outside namespace. So the owner references of namespace is enough to maintain the ownership information. And for all the resources in the namespace and also the namespace, we'll try to propose to put a well-defined label. It's something like multitenant.case.io/tenant equal to the tenant name. Tenant name is the name of the tenant CR. With that information, all other features in Kubernetes can be made multi-tenant aware. So by using this label, for example, like log and metrics, you collect from pod. By inspect the label of the pod, you can find out, okay, this log or metrics belong to this tenant. And all kinds of things can happen using this label. So the first flow will be very simple, just as Sanjeev described in the high level. The tenant admin creates a tenant CR, and the controller will automatically create a namespace and populate some basic policies into namespace. And if we go further with like a request-based end-to-end flow, I'm not sure if it's necessary. Maybe in some use cases it will be necessary. For example, we don't want to give the tenant admin the freestyle to create any tenant they want. We want some audit process, or the class admin has to review what they want to try to create. So we can introduce this tenant request CRD. So the tenant admin is not allowed to create tenant directly. Instead, they create tenant request by present what they want. The tenant request spec is very similar to the spec in the tenant CRD. And that gives a chance for the class admin to review everything the tenant admin is trying to create. But anyway, some automated approval process can still be possible based on some criteria. So that's beyond the scope of this document. We are not implement that today, so we can still leave that open and discuss that in future. So I will quickly skip that part. And we move to the short-term plan. We currently have defined 2 iterations. So as I said, the first iteration will implement tenant CRD without namespace template. The controller will populate basic policy objects into namespace when it's get created. So then the second iteration, we will define the namespace template and extend the CRD controller to populate policy objects from names template. So with 2 iterations, I think we can reach a relatively reasonable and useful shape that class admin can define a bunch of policies for a multi-tenant cluster, and we have a user flow to onboard tenant users. So that's all for this proposal. And if there's any questions or anyone want to help, you are always welcome. So one update, we've created a SIG-sponsored repo in Kubernetes sig-auth on GitHub. So we are going to publish some prototype code there, and if you want help, you can file any pull requests or file any issues on that repo. So that's all from my side.
Would now be an appropriate time to ask some questions, comments on the plan and the design that you've got here?
Yeah. Let me share the link of this document to the chat. Just give me a second. So if you join the multi-tenant working group, Google Groups, you have privilege to comment on a document.
Cool. I believe that I have. I'm a little bit uncomfortable, and I'll add this to the comment, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the CRD that the request model. So the tenant request CRD. I think I have some minor, I think evolution changes, modifications kind of things to the other pieces, but that tenant request one is kind of sticking with me as something that I think will feel odd when we use it with other Kubernetes resources. Would you rather I put it into the document, or is now an appropriate time to comment? Or I just don't want to. This is my first attempt at one of these meetings, and I just wanted to not.
Please feel free to comment on document or whatever. If you have any idea today, right now, you can just feel free to express. So for this kind of request, we are also uncertain. That's the reason even I didn't put that into the first 2 iterations. Just some ideas to be discussed in open.
Sure, and I think that's great. And that's why I wanted to, my concern at the moment is that it feels strange when I create other resources within Kubernetes. Many of them will sit in pending until they can be fulfilled in some way. And I don't need to create a request to get them. A good example is a load balancer. Until the load balancer IP is there, it just sits in pending, right? I think a workflow that allows things to sit in pending until something is ready to fulfill them feels more like it would work with the tools that I'm already used to. But I don't know if other people have similar
Alex, you're absolutely right. That is the tenant request object is the one that we feel least comfortable with right now. As Yisui said, right now the only absolutely mandatory CRD we will start with is the tenant CRD, right? Okay. Next come the template CRDs, and finally the tenant request CRDs. So we may choose never to do the tenant request CRD, but we will definitely do the tenant CRD in the first iteration, and the one or both of the template CRDs in the second iteration. We've kept it here just for completeness, but we totally share the same hesitation that you have about having that model. But we've kept it here for completeness so that maybe somebody in the working group might say, yes, I really need that one as well, in which case we'll retain it. But yes, that one is a little bit shaky even in our minds.
But I guess a question I would have is whether the tenant CRD definition would change if you knew that the model for creating it was going to be that the user just creates the tenant CRD directly. It goes into pending until it can be fulfilled. Like I don't know who it was who was just mentioning that, but like the workflow that was just described by the person who was commenting, like, would that change the design of the tenant CRD if you knew that there wasn't going to be a tenant request a CRD, but instead the tenant CRD would go into a pending state and then be fulfilled afterwards.
That's how we're designing it to begin with. So the first iteration does not depend on any tenant request CRD. The first iteration is exactly that model where you create a tenant, you just go ahead and create a tenant object, and either it is synchronously available to you, or you have a tenant status which you can poll, and it will let you know when the tenant state is ready. There is no explicit request response in that first model that we are proposing.
Okay,
So
and you're saying the design wouldn't
design is
change.
already designed according to that approach.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so probably introducing a pending state into tenant CRD will simplify the workflow with, so we don't need the tenant request anymore.
Yeah, so this is it sounds to me like there's precedence for the tenant CRD, like the way we do the certificate signing requests, right? So that's the same model where, so there's precedence for that. But also I was thinking, is it possible to sort of have a set of predefined, accepted, admin approved tenant namespace templates, where you would give view permission to a tenant admin to use, similar to how PSPs work, and then you wouldn't have to go through approval process, because by virtue of these things, having view permission to these pre-approved templates, then you can just create it. Yeah, again, if you go through that, that's exactly the option we've listed here for the tenant template case. So in the template case, the cluster admin has pre-created templates, and the normal tenant user will only view the templates that he's allowed to use to begin with. Mm-hmm. So implicitly the permission is already granted once he can see, I can see template 1, 2, and 3, but I cannot see template 4 and 5. Implies I don't have access to create template 4 and 5. So then I don't need an explicit request and response. Like you said, the request and response was partly motivated by certificate signing request kind of flow, but it may not be the best thing for this flow. But for now, we are keeping it for completeness. Maybe if somebody has a strong reason to keep it, but we're not going to implement that to begin with. So that's kind of priority 3 right now.
So this is Alex. I've got an unrelated question. So if I'm looking at this CRD, which defines what a tenant is, and we've got a spec that is a tenant spec, could we foresee multiple ways of implementing tenants? So we could say that this is a tenant spec and that is going to be implemented by the namespace tenant provider versus the, federated cluster provider or whatever. Does that work with the design as you're putting it together?
I'm trying to understand more about the different providers because today this design is based on a assumption which may be wrong. The tenant is going to be so we are trying to use namespace as a boundary of tenant, and this is kind of like namespace is kind of like the isolated boundary, so which provides a space we can populate policy objects. That's the reason we choose the namespace directly in the tenant spec. So I'd like to understand better. So if we treat that as in a provider model, can you give more example, like in case of like federation model? What would that look like?
Sure. I guess as I was hearing you explain this, which I should say, my first 2 questions may have sounded like criticisms. I don't intend them to. I think having this spelled out is very useful, and it had me thinking in a bunch of different directions. I just probably should have started with "Thank you for doing this," and this looks really great. So the thing that I was asking about was, as I was watching you describe what a tenant is, I started thinking, I could then create a tenant today if I have a dedicated namespace, a set of RBAC rules, some network policies, and some pod security policies. And if I just throw those together all into a single templated YAML file, I basically now have a tenant. But that's kind of cool. And I could throw more stuff into that, and that's kind of cool. And then I started thinking, well, what if I wanted to take that and move from a tenant which is co-located within the same cluster to a federated cluster? And I realized that a lot of those same things would still apply. A lot of the same concepts would apply. It just wouldn't be namespace within the same cluster. There would have to be some concept about federation. But that would only have to happen at a provider level. Like I would have to define which other clusters are available for federation at a higher level. But then that same RBAC network policy, pod security policy namespace could then be applied either in the same cluster or in a parallel cluster. And maybe I want to choose one or the other. And that led me back to maybe I want to think about a multiple provider model. So I have a provider that can do a local tenant and a provider that can do a federated tenant. And I get to choose at the provider level which one I would like.
So Alex, my thought on that is that, yeah, while that is a possibility, we do not want to initially scope this to be a federated tenant, right? This is a tenant within the scope of a single cluster. Could a future version of it be a multi-cluster tenant? Possibly, but we are still early enough here that we want to have some working demos in the next month or two, and depending on where that is shaping, then we could think about multi-cluster federated tenant. At the moment, this whole thing is single cluster, non-federated tenants, but nothing is stopping us from extending it, if things work well. But we want to keep the scope limited so that we can demonstrate some progress with a single intra-cluster tenant for now.
Yeah, that's clear. And that's very clear. And what I don't want to do is add more. I was just wondering if architecturally there's anything in your mind that would prevent this from becoming provider-driven rather than single CRD driven.
So, Alex, I appreciate all that. What you're saying is all great. Just historically, it's taken us an awful long time just to even get to a vague enough description of tenant that's going to suit, that we think will suit enough namespaces. I think so. We've already got an operator and tooling to do all of this stuff anyway. It's our own CRD. I think the problem with the federated case is there's a whole other layer of policy above that, because then you need who's allowed to create what kinds of tenants in which clusters. As a general problem to solve, I think that's going to take quite a few iterations to get to something. I think we can. I mean, we definitely should be on the roadmap, but I think we can park it for a while. Do you think?
Yeah, it was purely a educational. Like, I'm trying to understand more about the thinking behind it. If there's nothing in here that would prevent that, there's no reason we need to do it now. I was just wondering if there was anything in our thinking that would prevent going to that direction in the future.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, because there's the other thing of like you need to know that there's tooling in the background that has deployed that tenant namespace template to the cluster that you're trying to go onto as well. So there's an extra thing.
Yeah. Okay. But that's helpful. Thank you.
To reiterate, because we're trying to solve, there's so many different versions of tenants. Going from the single namespace per tenant to, we actually have a much more complicated version than this, but I think this will probably deal with it. But it's a slow process for us with enough people in this group to kind of all get to something that everybody's comfortable with. It's worth it, but it takes a while.
Yeah. So again, the goal here is to definitely have something working and demoable in the next month or 4 to 6 weeks at most. And that's why we've further broken down into iteration 1 and 2, possibly iteration 3 as well. And once we have something which we can touch and feel and play around with, we can take it in different directions, but we don't want to go there just yet. The other thing is, we've realized that you can't edict a particular isolation mechanism, because some people may want to use pod security policies and some people may not want to use pod security policies. Some people may want to use RBAC and some people may not want to use RBAC. So we, as part of defining, possibly during defining the templates, we will have just one out of many possible references. So that's why we separated out the machinery. This document is describing the machinery, not the contents of the machinery, the contents of the templates.
I think it's a really good starting point, but I've got a really dumb question. What namespace do the tenant CRDs go in, being that that's the thing that's creating the namespace that the tenant will then have access to?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. We can make the tenant CRD as a class scope object, but that definitely has a problem. Who has the permission to write this class scope object? So
I think the other problem is then everybody can see everybody's things.
I think we want to, if we must assign a workspace, namespace, it might be something like kube system.
Well, we can also put that into a namespace. Maybe Kubernetes system, maybe not a good idea. We can have a dedicated namespace for that. But I have no idea today. I think we can have a try. Maybe there are definitely some open questions left there. So
just as an aside, I'd love to see a standard pattern in Kubernetes for that. This has come up multiple times in other contexts. The idea of like sort of a new user to the system. How do they register without going through something out of band? Like if they're just going to use the existing Kubernetes cluster, and other than like requesting to create a namespace, which is kind of the one approach we have today. If we can put hooks around that, that's kind of a way for a new user to register. But if it requires creating kind of a custom resource or something like that, we really don't have a good way of doing it. So I think this is, I just want to mention this has come up. I've seen this several other times in other systems built on Kubernetes.
Yeah, I think there were 2 points discussed in that thread just now. One point was, where do we physically locate these objects called tenants and the controller and so on? And it looks like maybe it would be worthwhile having a new namespace just for that. And then the second point is the user workflow when coming in, requesting a new tenant. That is kind of what we've described in this document here, which is that any user can come in and request a new project. Effectively, that user would be the tenant admin of that new tenant project. So they wouldn't need to first create any namespace before requesting a tenant. The creation of the tenant also, as part of that, creates the namespace. Another thing is that there are some details which we need to work through. For example, right now we've got the names of the namespaces, but really, probably we should not even need the user to provide the names of the namespaces, but these should be internally generated names, perhaps. Again, we need to think that through, so that they should, we don't want two users requesting the same namespace name. I just say I want a tenant called, project A tenant, and under the covers, if that requires 3 namespaces, those namespace names are auto-generated so that they're non-conflicting with any other namespace in the cluster.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of a third problem, which is that if I've been onboarded through whatever process and I now have create, update, delete, and list and watch permissions on the namespace where the tenant's custom resources are, I can see and update and delete everybody else's.
Well, so the initial idea is we don't give update or delete permission to namespaces for tenant admin.
No, to the tenant CR. If I can create and edit my own CR in that.
Oh yes, you mean the tenant CR, right?
Yes.
So yes, so this is a problem today we have. There's a bunch of ways probably we can solve the problem by introducing a admission webhook. Because based on today's RBAC, it's very difficult to allow a self-service tenant CRD creation and without granting them the delete update on other tenant CRDs. But there's a lot of details, maybe premature to discuss, but there's probably ways we can solve with the webhook, the admission webhook.
Sure.
Again, but we will need to solve it without mandating the need of an admission webhook, right? Because some cluster, maybe I'm not saying the same thing that you're thinking, Yisui, but there will be clusters where there is no validating webhook, and you want to just do it with things like RBAC and.
Yeah. Well, I think that CRDs in general like require webhooks because that's the way, as I understand it, that's the way validation and defaulting work with CRDs. I mean, I could imagine that you could run a cluster without it if you say none of your CRDs require that, but I think that that would be considered something that you kind of have to have in your cluster, like the ability to run webhooks, admission webhooks in order to use CRD.
Can't you have RBAC permission for specific named objects? So like I say, create, I get a create project, a new project, then I get read-write permission to that named namespace. I don't get read-write permission to all namespaces or all tenants. So you can have RBAC rules to specific named resources.
Well,
yes,
that's actually very difficult to work with like class scope resources. I have tried a few times, but I didn't get that work on a like named resource, individual resource. It works well on like a resource type, like you can provide a CRD type, but probably I'm still missing something. So
yeah, I think we need to dig into this one because if I recall right, some of the guys who've done DIY solutions have had this problem as well. And we can look at what they've done. I think some people have actually defined entirely new RBAC verbs even. But yeah, so this is a good point to investigate further.
So we're out of time. I think we could definitely continue this discussion next time in 2 weeks. Folks could take the 2 weeks to look at the doc and make comments on it, and we could follow up with additional questions. But I think are you also looking for folks to help you implement this, or what's the story with that?
Probably I will start the first 2 iterations with Sanjeev together.
Okay, so maybe so in the next couple of weeks, you would suggest people just take a look at the doc, make comments, and then we can talk about it more in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think the comments are more important, especially at the beginning, to make sure the direction is correct. And
yeah, I agree. And the other thing that would be great to see is if folks, I know Sanjeev has mentioned he has contacts with customers, and if anybody here, some of the folks here are customers, using Kubernetes as an application they're running, but to get more input from folks who would be using this feature, that would be fantastic. I know Mike Arpaio gave a talk, and Mike Arpaio gave a talk about a tenant CRD at the last KubeCon that was really great, and getting more input from folks who are trying to solve the same problem and have problems that this would address would also be great. So bring your customers next time, I guess, is my would be, or talk to them yourselves, show them the stock, get feedback from them. That would be great to get kind of more not just developer input from developers, but also customers. Okay, anything else before we end the meeting? Okay, I guess we'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.